Sorry. So my name's Ursina. Studhalter, I'm also a sheep farmer, and I got asked to speak about cost of production tonight because I ended up writing an article about what it cost my farm or our costs for 2021, and just some of the methodologies and the ways I went about calculating it. So just a brief sort of outline of what I'll be talking about tonight includes cost of production versus enterprise budget, how I came up with my calculations, and then we'll get into some of the costs. So these are actual numbers. These are my 2021 financials. I didn't mess with them. It's pretty much what the CRA is getting. So that's what I'm sharing. I don't have too many comparatives because there's not a lot out there on cost of production. If you've looked around, there's very few Canadian data's easily accessible on what it costs to produce a lamb. So, and I will have take questions at the end. So starting with cost of production is basically the average cost of producing one unit of a commodity, in this case, a lamb. And it's the same as your total average cost, and it is going to be based entirely on your accounting records. So one of the main criticisms is that it doesn't include your opportunity costs and the costs of non-cash items. So example, owner labor, infrastructure costs, the cost of selling from one enterprise. So like if you have cropping, the cost of selling that crop to your lamb production, those things are all covered under enterprise budgets. That is where those calculations end up getting made. It's much more detailed. It's more into the economic profit. It takes care of all those things. Tonight, I'll only be speaking about the cost of production because it's a much easier number to calculate. And obviously an enterprise budget is a pretty thorough exercise that has to take into account numerous factors far beyond what you'll see in accounting records, but cost of production, I think, is a good place to start. So the formula is very simple. You just take your total cost, and it should be all items related to actual production. So if you have multiple enterprises going on, like if you have beef and lambs and you want to do cost of production of lambs, then you want to make sure you're only taking the total cost associated with those lambs, vice versa. If you have a machine shop or something, you want to take those numbers out, and you're going to divide that by your yield. Now the yield, it can be anything really, but the yield I'll be using tonight is marketable lambs. So I'm including my replacements in this number and all of the lambs that I have sold. I will include those numbers shortly, but you can also do it per acres if you're doing more of a cash crop based, or if you had like a grazing operation and it was important for you to understand what your cost was per acre that you're running. You could do it per liter if you're a dairy production or even sheep dairy, any of those. You could do it by ewe if your lamb numbers were kind of all over the place and you wanted to know what it was costing you per ewe to see if your lamb numbers per ewe needed to be improved. The yield is pretty much open to what you want to use. I'm going to be using marketable lambs tonight, and that is, again, replacements and the numbers sold for the entire 2021 period. So a bit about our farm. We're actually up in Shawville, Quebec. We produced 526 marketable lambs. We did have about 200 of those on hand at Christmas, so year end, but we're halfway through selling them now. So there's a bit of cost associated with the fact that they kept going. We were still feeding them, but I also had overlap from the previous year in 2021, so it kind of evens out. So that would be the denominator. That was my yield. This came from about 220 ewes. We did lamb twice, so that is 2 rotations. We're not terribly prolific. We're probably running about 1.5, 1.8 lambs per ewe per lambing. and we are entirely indoor. We don't graze at this point. Gallagher lost my fencing order, literally. And we produce most of our own hay, but not any grains. We're on an undrained former horse farm that wasn't really operated until we bought it 5 years ago. It was just overgrown. So it's just forage production. It is class 4 beach sand, literally. Makes great for construction, not so great for anything else. So that's kind of the farm. That is our farm. That is kind of the numbers. That's where the numbers are coming from. It's a one-man show for the most part. My husband runs this place. He's here all the time. He doesn't have off-farm income. As mentioned in the introduction, I am a chartered professional accountant. That is what I do during the day. And I just wanted to include this so you had an idea of what kind of farm these numbers were coming from. So I also wanted to include the type of inputs that we use, because I find this might give you a better insight as to where the costs were coming from and how this might relate to your operation if you want to go down that road. And it's always a fun number for me to look at, because I like to see how much hay we're using, how much creep, just to see if we're using more or less. We put a lot of effort into better hay this year, so it seemed to have paid off because we needed less grain. So we used 5.4 tons of creep, pelleted feed, and supplements. So the start of 2021, we were feeding supplements to the ewes, just because the hay we ended up having to buy was kind of subpar. So needed some top up there. We fed 582 bales of hay. That's the entire flock. Everything's included in this cost. Like, there's nothing split out for any other critter or any other type of sheep. And in a different stage of production, everything's assigned to the lambs here. And those would be both big squares and round bales. And over half of them were purchased because 2020 was a pretty bad drought year for us here. We went to Southern Ontario to buy hay because we couldn't find anything here. We had essentially a bale an acre. So not so great. And then we feed almost exclusively barley, 21 tons for 2021. And just for top up, because we do an MGA program, we used 1.5 tons of corn. Corn was ridiculously expensive this year compared to barley, and it's hard to get. So we mainly stick with barley because it's much easier for me to order and purchase. So in terms of how I calculated my costs, there's some methodology involved a spreadsheet. I took my financials for 2021 and I then I added the cost of the hay that was on hand at the end of 2020. So we actually track every bale we feed, every bag of feed. I have entire tables. I know what supplier they came from. I know which lot they came from in terms of hay, what the nutrition analysis was. Everything's tracked, so it's fairly easy for me to match up invoices for things that may have been paid in 2020, but were actually fed in 2021. So that was included in the cost. And I've deducted the hay because we did purchase some in 2021 as well. Had a good opportunity, took advantage. And we had that hay on hand in December. So I deducted that cost out of the 2021 numbers, as well as some feed that was on hand. And we prepaid a barley contract in the fall. So I removed the cost of that contract because we haven't fed all of it. We haven't even bought all of it. And I did also take out any other prepaid expenses. So there's a bunch of 2022 fertilizer costs and stuff that we all had to pay in December. That all got removed because we haven't received those items. We haven't used them. That cost counts, to me, that counts towards 2022. Yeah, and it's essentially, I was focusing on costs that were consumed in 2021. So there were some minor adjustments. Again, mainly just hay purchases, feed purchases, and then fertilizer and prepaid grain contracts that were adjusted for. And that gave me essentially my total cost for the year. So I split my costs into two categories, starting with variable costs. So if you're not familiar with variable costs, they're essentially the costs that are directly tied to your level of production. So these are costs that if I sell my sheep tomorrow, I probably won't have these bills anymore, 99% certain. So they vary based on the number of lambs we produce, the number of ewes. That's a variable cost. It goes up and down depending on your production. In the variable costs for this exercise, I included feed purchases, which includes grain, minerals, supplements, even hay, actually. All the costs associated with producing our own hay. So that with fertilizer, twine, net wrap, fuel and repairs, custom work, because we don't actually own any equipment, and veterinary costs, breeding ram purchases. We buy rams every year for our ewes, don't keep any back. And as mentioned a slide or two ago, we do MGA in the spring, so we use more rams than average. We like to have a collection. We have less typical breeds. We're running hair sheep, so I'm always on the lookout for new bloodlines. I'm pretty much buying them all the time, and it's a fairly consistent number, so I include that. Custom work, in addition to the hay custom work, we also had to get custom work for manure spreading. The spreader sort of fell apart, so I had to get that done. Thankfully, we have a good service locally who was able to handle that. And then selling costs includes tags. So our tags are $1.80 here, and it's the A-Flex tags, and I use those for herd management as well. So the government tags are the same. Transportation, we hire somebody to do that. And obviously commission and selling costs, because all of our lambs are sold through Embrum, the Ottawa Livestock Exchange. Oh, and we produce light lambs. So all of our lambs are 79 pounds and under. The average weight we sell at is usually around 62 to 75 pounds. That's kind of the weight we go for. And we try to get them out of here.
I've told you not to hit anything with that stick.
90 days to 150. I know that sounds long, but it's,
yes, and
light lambs are not always in demand in the fall. So these are, since we only produce hay and not enough hay most of the time, we purchase our feed. So our purchased feed costs this year for 2021, so last year, I guess, were $56.87 per lamb. And so that's per marketable lamb that was produced that I either kept back or could have sold. And that number consists of $10 worth of pellets. So that would be creep feed and such. It's basically prepared feed. We buy it by the tote or the bag. Grain, almost exclusively barley. There's a little bit of corn in there. Grain is $15.86. Minerals is $1.29. It's just the standard minerals you buy. Ours is I think right now we're using Master Feeds. So we have the nice PVC feeders and it's free choice. No TMR or anything. And then purchased hay is $29.49 for last year. This is probably the number that we're trying the hardest to push down and improve production on our own fields. And every year, even with a drought, we get a few more bales. We're improving. We spend a lot on fertilizer comparatively for improving the land that we have. And that cost, those homegrown hay costs, came out to $32.69. And again, the big difference is 2020 hay cost us about $105 a bale to bring in. When we produce it ourselves, it's about $46. So the more hay we can produce ourselves, the better off we are. And that is the hay cost. Not only is it 50% of our costs, or more than that, actually, closer to 62%. That cost is the one we have I feel we have the most flexibility. We get pretty consistent grain prices. The supplier we deal with there is great. They allow us to, like I said, prepay our grain. So I have a fixed cost to work with. But hay, which depends on weather, is kind of the number that we want to push down the most and we have the most playroom with. And yes, our land could produce all the hay we had based on acreages, but due to the lack of rain and the fact that the land was so run down when we bought it, it can't. Like, we're doing really well to get 3 bales an acre, and it's improving, but it's a slow process. So that combined, I wanted to split out the feed cost because I feel that is, as you can see here, that is the biggest part of the variable costs. And instead of just putting that it's basically $90, I wanted to split out and show what the components were. So of that $90, a significant portion is hay, and then a smaller portion would be the grains and pellets. So the variable costs for this year were $90 for feed, $6.70 for vet and breeding. So that actually includes all of our MGA program costs and all of the RAM purchases for the year. Bedding is $6 and, well, $7. Again, we have to buy in the straw. We go through a lot of straw because it's indoor, but it's that number down here, about 100. We bought 100 bales and needed 70 for the year, so it's not that bad. And then marketing, which consists of the trailering, the commission, and the tags, and that is calculated over all the lambs, $15.42. However, for the actual lambs that we sold, if I calculate it down to that number, it was $26 a head. And the good chunk of that, so 14, yeah, probably around $14 a head is trucking, and the remainder is commission and other fees that get deducted at the sales barn. So we have looked at trucking them ourselves, but it's time consuming. It would take a half a day. And in terms of the cost of running a truck and trailer, and it's more than what it costs us to hire somebody. We have somebody who will come and pick up an entire load of lambs, however many we can fit. He can take 60 at a time, and that's about $400 for the whole trailer. So that ratio is going down all the time, the more we can sell, and we're usually filling the trailer with another local producer. So, like example, we sold some this week, and there was probably about 54 lambs on the truck from 2 farms. That cost is continuously going down, and we've made efforts to keep it at about a reasonable level. So from the variable costs, which again were $18 or $118, sorry, the fixed costs would be the next portion. And these are costs that they happen regardless of how many lambs we produce. They're fairly consistent. Some of them could arguably be variable costs, but reality is they haven't changed much for us over the last 4 or 5 years. And they're probably going to be incurred regardless. So it's mortgage interest, property taxes, vehicle expenses. So our fuel bill for the pickup truck to run and grab feed, which is almost the same every year, probably won't be this year. Utilities, office expenses, professional fees, which is almost nothing because I can do my own. And the building repairs, which is a fairly consistent number. We do have 2 guardian dogs because we are surrounded by forest and there is pressure. Their main job is to keep things from going in the barn, and then insurance. So these costs really haven't varied much over the years, and the more lambs we produce, the lower they get. So I didn't include them separately, but they are $56. That was the total cost, but they are shown here on the chart. So we've got insurance. That's actually $8.63 per lamb. It keeps going up. It is not a fun number. It's the one I have the least control over. We only have one insurance provider willing to do farms in this area. It's a bit of frustration there. Property, so in property, which is $25.68, I've got my mortgage cost and property taxes. They kind of go hand in hand. Our mortgage cost is pretty minimal. We're fairly fortunate that way. I think it's $1,400 or something. It's not a big number in the grand scheme of things. Insurance is much higher. And then building repairs and utilities, it's $7.41. We're pretty fortunate that way. We have 2 meters and our barn is on a separate meter. So it's very easy for me to track exactly how much power the barn is using. And that's a pretty minimal amount. I think it's around $45 a month right now. We didn't have hydro for the sheep until 2 years ago. So we're pretty good at working without that. The marketing, again, as shown before, same with bedding and the breeding, vet, and feed costs. The other costs would include some of those other items I listed before. So the $13.84 is going to include vehicle, office expenses, the guardian dogs, and a couple of other minor miscellaneous categories that happen every year. And the combined total in that case comes out to $174.20 per marketable lamb. It's probably pretty high, but again, there's not much out there on comparisons. So the closest comparison I could find is CPAC, that's the Quebec organization. They index their numbers. And when I compared their categories to my categories, they estimated $84 or $184 in total costs using the same expense categories, but it appears that they are using some opportunity costs. So it is 174. Last year was really good though. We got an average gross revenue return of $225 per lamb, which I'm happy with. It gives me a reasonable margin. And we did not sell all the lambs, obviously, but still came out on the plus side. So there are shortfalls to cost of production, which I kind of alluded to at the very beginning of this. The shortfalls are going to include, there's no labor included here. We're not incorporated, can't include that as an expense item. The way I deal with this is I have a profit first calculation. So automatically off of our revenue, I have calculated a number that's equivalent to the minimum wage, which is $13.50. And if my husband were to be working a minimum wage job, it's kind of what the farms around here pay. It's what he's qualified for. We get enough, I set enough aside using that percentage to cover what he would have probably made if he worked somewhere else. So that is not built into the calculation because I can't build it in on an accounting basis, but it is accounted for when I'm doing my budgets and stuff. The infrastructure costs are also not included because it's based on whatever the tax scenario ends up being for the year. And I did calculate it based on the cost of our buildings and current CCA rates, so 4% of the total cost of buildings divided by the number of lambs. And that came out to about $13 a lamb. I'd like to get that number lower, but I also don't know how you can build a barn for less than what we built it for 4 years ago. So our barn cost $450 per U space, and it's built for 300 U's. So it's fairly affordable from that stance. And we decreased our mortality rate to almost nothing, switching into the barn from a combined indoor-outdoor setup. And again, very limited equipment costs because all we have is a little 784 International tractor. The rest is all custom work or share equipment shares where we pay fuel and all of the repairs on some equipment. In exchange, my husband works for the guy. So that's kind of how we take care of that number. So you would be getting closer to the $200 mark if we included both labor and infrastructure costs. And again, this is where the enterprise budget would be better and does take that into consideration, because you're only using, or I only use numbers that were from my accounting records. So the general uses for the cost of production and why I think it's something you should do. It allows you to compare to your previous years while also taking productivity into consideration. So we're still a fairly young farm, 5 years into this whole sheep game. And we've ramped up our lamb production every single year and the number of ewes. So obviously my costs in grand total are going up every single year. But if I don't take into account the number of lambs we produce, it looks lopsided. So by taking the number of marketable lambs I've produced, I can compare it to my 2020 numbers, which were significantly higher than this year's, with all the hay we had to buy in. So it allows me to lay those numbers out and kind of compare them based on what we actually produced, not just the grand total. Because there's certain categories that no matter how hard I try, like my feed cost is not going to go down because I'm producing more lambs. It's also a good start for your budgets. If you've ever read my blog, you'll know I'm a huge fan of budgets. I like the spreadsheets. I like knowing approximately what it's going to cost. We regularly get made fun of at retailers because my husband has a literal list in his wallet of what I intend to spend on certain items when he's in the feed store. Like, it is calculated out. We do not actually have any operating loans. We never got any, couldn't get any. So we had to learn this, and cost of production is a way that we use our budgets to make sure that we always have enough cash on hand. Because otherwise we're kind of up a creek. And it's also great information to have when you're negotiating a sale or a purchase. So if you're doing direct marketing or selling a trailer load of lambs, knowing what your cost of production is gives you a starting point. Like, if somebody walks into my barn and says, I'll give you $150 a lamb, probably not going to sell them for that. It'd have to be a really crazy scenario. And the same as with a purchase. If I'm going out to buy ewe lambs, I know roughly what it costs me to produce mine. So when the other producer comes back with a number, I have an idea of where that fits in with my cost of production and if that's a reasonable number. Like, I'm not going to undershoot. I'm not going to go into somebody and try to buy their ewe lambs for $175 when realistically I should be paying probably $250, so that they still, so I'm not lowballing them. Like, I know approximately what it costs to produce the lambs. And it gives you a quick overview of possible profitability. We all know how to log on to Sheep Farmers of Ontario's website with the marketing. Fairly easy calculation to figure out what the lamb price per pound is right now. And based on that, I've done some marketing calculations, which is why we don't sell in the fall. It costs me about $8 extra to feed those lambs for an extra 30 days. Quite often holding them to December works out pretty well compared to selling them in October. And it also gives me an idea that I want to keep doing MGA because it is working very well for us. Like, we did it last year. All of those lambs were October, November. They're hitting the market in January at really good prices. So it gives me some idea of where to look when I'm looking at the seasonal cycle for the lambs. And apparently I talk really fast. So I guess questions, I can go back to other slides if that would help. I actually have the CPAC study up. Let's see if I can get it here. So this is actually the CPAC. I know it's in French, but this is how they do their calculations. And yeah, it is more enterprise budget based. But yeah, that is cost of production for our farm, and maybe it gives you a starting point, or maybe you think I'm all the way out to lunch. That's all right. Gotten used to that.
Okay, there's a question in the chat there from Celeste. She's just asking if you can explain what MGA is.
Oh, okay. Yep. I'm sorry, I don't see the chat screen. So MGA is a powder-based additive to feed that has a similar result to using seeders. It's entirely feed-based. It is really labor-intensive, straight up. We have cell phone alarms to make sure it gets fed at the right time, but it costs a fraction of what a seeder costs. And when we got into doing MGA, we were pretty broke. So we went with that route. We feed it twice a day, 14 days. Then we give the Folligan injection. We put the rams in. And from that point on, it's basically like a seeder program. So it works out to, if I have that cost, I think my MGA is about $4 a U plus the shot and everything. Like cost wise, it worked out for me at the time, and we have the time to do the feeding.
Perfect. There's a Jim Bennett's got his hand raised there. Go ahead, Jim.
Hey, just explain again the CPAC. That's like the Quebec, like a accounting sort of enterprise budget thing, or how does that work again? What we're looking at here.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is their sort of their economic study center. They do one for all sorts of livestock units. They've got beef, they've got all the different animals. Okay. And they did this study. So this one was based on numbers in 2016, and they have just been adjusting it for every year 2020. And they actually base our entire risk management off of the numbers that they have calculated here. So my French is not awesome, but getting there. It was based on 36 different farms with ewes between 325 and 1,200 ewes. And the sample enterprise that they're using here has 529 ewes, produced 833 lambs, and then they have the number of kilos on the sidebar there that they produced. And these are mainly base costs here, but this here is the first column here is by the ewe, and this is their variable costs. This part is by lamb, so the 237 is by lamb, and the last number is per 100 kilos sold. They do actually include in here their ASRA contributions and other FADQ program contributions. I did not include those in my calculations. They kind of net out with what we get for ASRA. Depends on the year. And yeah, and then underneath here they have fixed costs, and at the bottom here this numeration du travail is their labor cost.
Nice.
So this is the closest thing I could find that was in a Canadian context and readily accessible.
So okay, so I see Anita's on here. Do you know, Anita, do we have something similar to that, or how do we base our risk management in Ontario? How does it work?
So risk management in terms of the cost of production, is that what you're asking, Jim? That how do they come up with a cost of production?
Yeah, how they got all these numbers, yeah.
So I don't sit on that committee, but
Okay.
my understanding is that they use for all of you producers that are on oh, the name has gone off my head. It's to do with the federal program. And you submit your numbers.
Tiger stability.
Oh, legibility, yeah.
Agri stability, thank you.
Yeah.
So they use the summaries of those to calculate a cost of production.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, this is downloadable from the website. You just Google that and you can look it up. It's downloadable and they've got pretty much every year available. And that's why I included it here tonight, because it's easily accessible and it is in a Canadian context. So it's the best I can find.
The government of Manitoba also has a site, by the way, that publishes, I believe, every year,
Okay.
kind of similar scenario. And last one I saw, they base it on 500 ewes, I think, 500 ewes or 500 lambs. I can't remember which.
I'll have to check that out.
They do it every year, though.
Okay, does anyone else have any more questions out there for Ursina before we move
Yeah.
on?
Yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
You said that you had hair sheep. Do you have Katahdins or Dorpers?
Both and Romanoff.
Both of them.
So we started with Katahdins. They are, at this point, probably half of our Katahdins are actually half Katahdin, half Romanoff. We had a really bad year one year and I found a Romanoff ram and he saved us. And now we're breeding in more Dorper. So the base flock to use are either Katahdins or Katahdin Romanoff. And then the rams are either Katahdin, Romanoff, or right now I'm running 6 Dorpers, I think. And I'm starting to bring in half Katahdin, half Dorpers from another farm. So that is kind of what we breed. They're a little different. So there's no shearing cost in any of that. Forgot to mention that because I always forget.
Well, you got it right, Steve. That's what I have.
Any other questions out there, guys?